not allowed inside any building on Brown's campus. In the event of an emergency, please walk calmly and quickly to one of the marked exits and move away from the building. Thank you for your cooperation.
Thank you. I think it's been a long time since I've introduced a big event like this in this room, and it's fantastic to be here. So good evening. I'm Chris Paxson. I'm president of Brown University, and I'm just thrilled to welcome all of you tonight to the Lemley Family Leadership Lecture. We are honored to have with us tonight Stanford University Professor Guido Imbens, who will speak to us about causality in data science. Now, I'm an economist. I've known Guido and his work for many years. And when I came to Brown a decade ago, I was thrilled to learn that he had earned his master's degree and his Ph.D. in economics from Brown. And he's been a regular collaborator with Brown faculty and students over the years. And as you probably also know, because I think it's up there on the sign, that he recently won the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, along with David Card and Josh Angrist for their work on causal inference. So congratulations, Guido, for that prize. Now, the fact that he is with us here tonight stems from the generosity of Wayne Lemley, who is another Brown PhD graduate, whose generosity has made this series possible. And what the Lemley Lecture Series does is it highlights really accomplished scholars and thought leaders and policymakers and practitioners who inform and challenge and educate us. And it's a really central piece of developing Brown's very vibrant intellectual community. So thanks to Wayne's support, we now have new opportunities to bring exceptional leaders to campus to engage and inspire us. So far, eminent figures such as Nobel Prize winner Jennifer Doudna, Pulitzer Prize winner Isabel Wilkerson, Harvard Business School professor Rebecca Henderson, and now Professor Imbens. Wayne has been a fervent supporter of Brown for many years through the Nelson Center for Entrepreneurship, the School of Engineering, and so much more, and we're really grateful to everything that he's doing for the university. So again, delighted to have all of you here. I'm going to turn the podium over to Provost Locke, who will make a few remarks and introduce our speaker. So Rick.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really wonderful to see you. So many people in this room, and as President Paxson said, it's just great. It feels almost normal to be back. My name is Rick Locke. I'm a professor of political science and international and public affairs, and I have the great pleasure of serving as provost here at Brown. I'd like to thank you all for coming to this event, and again, also thanking the Lemley family for their generosity in hosting this event. And it's really a distinct pleasure to introduce Guido Imbens, the Applied Econometrics professor at Stanford's Graduate School of Business, and also professor of economics at Stanford's Department of Economics. Guido attended Erasmus University in the Netherlands for his undergraduate education and met his mentor, Tony Lancaster, at the University of Hull in the United Kingdom. He then followed Professor Lancaster to Brown to do his PhD in 1986. And Professor Lancaster, who unfortunately was unable to join us this evening, is the Herbert Goldberger Professor Emeritus of Economics here at Brown and served as the chair of the Economics Department for many years. Together, Professor Lancaster and Professor Imbens worked on problems of homelessness in New York City by applying econometric methods to understand the causes of homelessness and the difficulties that were faced by homeless populations. This was the beginning of Guido's interest in econometrics and in particular methods of drawing causal inferences from experimental and observational data. Throughout his career, Guido focused on developing methodologies and frameworks to help economists use real-life situations known as natural experiments to test theories. In addition to studying homeless populations and unemployment, Guido has analyzed important questions such as the impact of college education and additional years of education on earnings. He has published extensively in the leading economics and statistics journals and currently serves as the editor-in-chief of Econometrics, which is one of the field's leading journals. Together with Donald Rubin, he has published a book entitled Causal Inferences in Statistics, Social, and Biomedical Sciences. He held tenured positions at UCLA, UC Berkeley, and Harvard prior to joining Stanford in 2012. And he has tons of awards. The Nobel Prize is just one of them, but tons of awards, including and prestigious fellowships in the Econometrics Society, the Royal Holland Society of Sciences and Humanities, the Royal Netherlands Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Statistical Association. In this lecture, Guido will discuss some of the history of econometric methods used to draw credible causal inferences, with a particular focus on the recent credibility revolution in economics. We are very fortunate to have Professor Imbens back with us here at Brown, and so please join me in welcoming Professor Imbens.
Well, thanks very much for that kind introduction. It's great to be back here at Brown. I had a very good time when I was a graduate student here, and I've been back many times over the years. I was supposed to be here 2 years ago, and that was actually the first trip that I canceled when the pandemic started. So I was very happy to get invited back again today, and so I'm very happy to be here. I'm also very impressed to see such a big crowd. It's not easy to get a big crowd for an econometrics talk, typically. And I also saw earlier, before the talk, that I have actually a fair number of questions people have for the Q&A, which is great. It's great. It's particularly important to have questions in cases like this. Even though when I started off in econometrics, I wasn't very good at asking questions myself. I remember when I was an undergraduate in Rotterdam, I was, so this is about 40 years ago, I was taking a class on macroeconomics. And so we were analyzing kind of big macroeconomic models. And there was, we were studying a set of models where you could there was money, you could buy goods, and you could buy bonds. And it wasn't really till the end of the semester that when we were studying for the exam that I realized I didn't actually know what bonds were. I didn't know what goods were. You would go to the store, you would buy goods, and you would pay cash for them. But that was sort of as far as this seemed to correspond to reality. And I was thinking, okay, well, that's my problem. But then I started asking around, and it turned out that actually nobody in my class had any idea what bonds were. And so we were doing perfectly fine in the class. We were doing all the mathematics, and we were doing all the questions that were asked at the exam. But we actually had no idea what we were doing and what it actually meant and what it corresponded to. And so one of the things I learned there was actually, yes, it is really important to kind of just keep track of what things are about. And so when I came to Brown after my undergraduate experience in the Netherlands and a brief spell in England, the program here was actually very good from my perspective. It was really terrific in kind of focusing us on what the real questions were and kind of making sure that things were actually tied to what was going on in the real world. And so it really put me in a much better position to start doing research that has at least some chance of having an impact. And so what I want to do in this lecture is share with you some of the things I've learned over the years since graduating from Brown, and why data science and econometrics and causality are currently such interesting fields. And so let me start by just giving some background to how I got here. as I mentioned, I grew up in the Netherlands, where in high school, when I was in high school, my economics teacher introduced me to the work by Tinbergen, who was one of the first Nobel laureates in economics. And the fact that he was doing this technically sophisticated work, I was very interested in mathematics at the time, but at the same time he was doing things that were of great relevance for society. He was involved with the Dutch government, advising the Dutch government. He was involved in the League of Nations before World War II and later the United Nations. That really appealed to me. And so I decided to go study econometrics in Rotterdam, where there was a program that Tinbergen had set up. From there, I went to the University of Hull, and then, as the provost mentioned, I met Tony Lancaster there, who was about to move to Brown, and so I followed Tony Lancaster to Brown. And I remember very vividly arriving here in the US. I'd never been to the US before, so I remember arriving at Logan Airport, and it was a little bit like a scene in Mulholland Drive where one of the main characters arrives at Los Angeles airport. The sky just seemed bluer than what I'd ever seen. The cars were bigger than what I'd ever seen. And it just seemed a very overwhelming experience. And so I took the bus to Providence and I got temporary housing in one of the dorms here at Brown. I remember outside there was a cheerleading summer camp going on. So America made a big impression that first day. But I really enjoyed my years at Brown, and it was an incredibly hospitable place. Another memorable experience was that a couple of other foreign graduate students and I got invited by the then chair in the economics department for a Thanksgiving dinner. And ever since, nowadays, my wife, Susan, was also an economist at Stanford, and I try to invite graduate students, foreign graduate students, over for Thanksgiving. But it was really just an incredibly welcoming place, and it really helped me transition from being a very technical econometrician to a more rounded economist. And so after that, I got my first job at Harvard, and then via UCLA, Berkeley, back to Harvard. I ended up at Stanford, where I've been since 2012. So what I want to do next is kind of talk about some of the work I've done, which has centered really on causal effects in various forms. And so I'll talk a little bit about randomized experiments, about observational studies, and how we got to the credibility revolution and the natural experiments for which David Cart, Josh, and I got awarded the Nobel Prize. So the rest of the organization, I first want to talk a little bit about what I mean by causality, and I want to give a brief history of two traditions where people have studied causal effects, one in statistics, one in econometrics, and more generally in social sciences. And then I will go through a couple of studies that fit into this natural experiments literature, where we're really trying to, outside of completely randomized experiment, outside of the case where we're really very sure we get causal effects, where we can still make credible causal inferences and kind of look at how we do that, what type of methods we use, how we come up with these things, and then I will conclude. But so the first thing about causality is really that to say that correlation is not causality. Well, in some sense, it's really the second thing. The first thing is to make sure that it's not misspelled as causal. When in 1995, when I was at Harvard, Don Rubin and I started collaborating, and we wanted to teach a course on causality. So we wrote a very clear and careful course description there. And then it went to the registrar's office. We thought we were probably wrong, and they changed every of the 10 instances of the word causal by causal, which led to a lot of confusion by the students. But even to this day that happens, on October 11th, NPR announced that Josh Angrist and I shared the Nobel Prize for our empirical studies on casual relationships. Our spouses were surprised by that. But so back to kind of the correlation not being the same as causality, there's kind of many of these examples here, sort of two that you see very often coming up. Clearly, the rooster crowing doesn't cause the sun to rise, nor do ice cream sales cause shark attacks, even though there's a reasonably strong correlation there. Here are some actual data. You may be surprised to see there that the correlation is actually negative here between the ice cream sales and the shark attacks. And the reason is it's actually ice cream sales in Florida and shark attacks in Australia. And so it's sort of clear that there's no causal relationship there, but because when it's warm in Florida, it's cold in Australia and the other way around. And so you get this negative correlation. But so, given that the correlation is not, that causality is not correlation, what is it really? And so I want to think of it in terms of an action, of a manipulation, of some action that can have a consequence. And so suppose you have a headache, you've been going to too many classes, listening to too many lectures. You can take an aspirin or not take an aspirin. And the way you want to think about causal effects is that it's thinking about the outcome that would result if you took the aspirin and compare that to the outcome that would result if you didn't take the aspirin. And there's kind of two key things in that example. One is that it's not kind of a causal effect in the abstract sense, but it's a causal effect tied to manipulation, tied to a particular action. In some sense, that's actually very helpful because it makes these things often policy relevant. It's not what is the effect of being old or the effect of being like this or like that. It's what can we do to actually change things and what is the effect of changing something. And the second thing is that we can never observe causal effects. I cannot at the same time take the aspirin and see what happens to my headache if I take the aspirin and not take the aspirin and see what happens to my headache if I don't take the aspirin. At most, one of these things can be observed. I either take the aspirin and see what happens then, or I don't take the aspirin and see what happens in that case. And so it's always going to be about missing data. And so we're going to need to use statistics and we're going to try to estimate these things, but there's always going to be uncertainty there. Sometimes that uncertainty may be very, very minimal, and maybe we can do things, changing things over time. And in many settings, we think things are very stable in a way that allows us to get very close to directly measuring causal effects. But at some level, we can never see the same unit at the same point in time in two regimes. One of these is a counterfactual. It's corresponding to something that didn't happen, and so we cannot actually see it. So kind of going a little further, there's really four critical concepts in this view on causality. One is, and I think Don Rubin kind of first expressed it this way, that to think about causation, you need to think about a manipulation. You need to think about an action that it corresponds to. Second is that you're always going to need multiple units. It may be the same physical unit at different points in time, but there need to be comparisons of units exposed to some treatment and units not exposed to that treatment or exposed to something different. Third, that's going to make it tricky, and we need to be very careful when we talk about causal effects of attributes rather than causal variables. It's not clear in this perspective what you mean by saying this happened because this person is old, because it's not quite clear what it means for that same person to be young at the same point in time. Sometimes you can, and so what this perspective does is it forces you to think carefully about what that manipulation is. And so, for example, in cases of gender discrimination or racial discrimination, you have to be very careful about what you're trying to learn. And people have done very clever studies where even though you can't really change gender, or at least there's not a lot of data where that would be the relevant thing, or change race, you can sometimes change the perception of someone's race, or change the perception of someone's gender. And there's a study where Claudia Golden and C.C. Rouse looked at the effect of having orchestra auditions where the people judging the performance cannot see the people relative to cases where they see the people. And there's a study by Marianne Bertrand and Sandor Mulanithan where they send in job applications and they change the names on the applications so that people think the person is likely to be white or African American or another ethnicity, even though that's obviously not necessarily capturing all the aspects of discrimination we may be interested in. But it's important to think about what the actual manipulation is we're interested in, because that's partly what makes it policy relevant. Now, what are some examples of causal effects we may be interested in? We may be interested in the effect of a vaccine on COVID rates. We may be interested in the effect of going to college on earnings. And I'm going to come back to that example later, we may be interested in the effect of military service on labor supply or earnings. And this is partly from a study I did with Bruce Sasserdote and Don Rubin, we may be interested in the effect of universal basic income on labor supply. Or we may be interested in the effect of a change in tax rates on sales. In all these cases, it's very clear what the manipulation is, what the policy is we're actually trying to think about. And then we can start thinking carefully and clearly about what the causal effects are. Now, how did this all start? So in the 1920s and 30s, there were really two traditions looking at causal effects. In statistics, starting with the work by Fisher and Neyman, the focus was very much on randomized experiments. It was focused on settings where chance determined who got which treatment. So Fisher kind of was for a while at the Rotherham Agricultural Station, and so they would do experiments where they're interested in whether fertilizer A or fertilizer B was better. And so they would take a plot of land, divide it in a number of subplots, put fertilizer A in some places, fertilizer B in other places, wait till the end of the season, measure the yields, and then look at what the effect was of fertilizer A, fertilizer B. These plots of land didn't have any choice which fertilizer they got. It was just applied to them. In social sciences, often we can't do that. And so the focus was much more on settings where the units, the individuals, had some say in what treatment they got. Maybe not completely, but there was at least some agency there, and they made choices themselves. And that came from the fact that in many cases we can't do experiments in economics. We cannot take a set of young people and say that some of them have to go to college and others are not allowed to go to college. And so in many cases we're forced to make do with these observational studies. And that's going to make it intrinsically more difficult to disentangle the part that comes from the choice and the part that comes from the chance. Now, kind of to make it more specific, here's a very simple example of one of these randomized experiments. This is from a paper by some biomedical researchers, and they were interested in the effect of giving kids who were having trouble sleeping, because they were coughing too much, giving them honey or not. And so, maybe that actually works, maybe it doesn't. They just did an experiment. They took 72 children, they randomly selected which ones got the honey, which ones didn't. They measured how much they were coughing during the night, and then the next day they looked at the difference between these two groups, and they found that clearly the group that got the honey was coughing less than the group that didn't get the honey. And so in a very simple experiment, you very convincingly can make the case that the honey had a causal effect there on the cough frequency. And so that's really an incredibly powerful idea. Even though we can't be sure for any particular kid whether this helped them, we could really be very sure that the honey helped on average. And so kind of building on that type of simple experiment, using randomized clinical trials became the gold standard in causal inference. In fact, it is mandated now by Congress that for new drug approvals, you do randomized experiments, partly based on the fact that a number of times the observational studies led to very misleading results and led to very severe side effects. There's now enshrined in law rules that you have to do a randomized experiments, and that there are very specific protocols how these studies have to be done to make to make this work. And kind of nowadays, there's even more of these trials being done in the private sector, in the tech companies, where tens of thousands of randomized experiments are being done continually. So given that these experiments are so great, why are we not using them in economics? Well, that's kind of a tricky question. In fact, we are using them. We had used them in the past somewhat. In the 70s, there were some really big experiments done called the negative income tax experiments, where they also tried to look at issues related to universal basic income and what would happen if you change tax rates at low income levels. But those are very expensive. And even though they were incredibly expensive, they were still underpowered, so we didn't really learn as much from them as we wanted to. Later, there were a bunch of experiments for labor market programs, but the general view was that it was really hard to do experiments in economics. In many cases, it was too expensive. In other cases, it was not ethical to do, as in the college example. So economists weren't really doing a lot of experiments. But that changed suddenly in the late 90s when a group of development economists challenged kind of the conventional wisdom there and started doing experiments. And Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Michael Kramer started doing experiments in development economics. And moreover, they created really a movement where people started doing experiments in many parts of economics, often kind of relatively small treatments, but showing that they did actually make a big difference and that they were very cost-efficient interventions in many cases. This is really a remarkable achievement, and they were awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for that in 2019. But so going back to the 1920s, when the economists were also looking at causal effects, but looking at cases where you really couldn't do randomized experiments, or at least where they hadn't done randomized experiments, they took a very different approach. So Tinbergen, in one of his papers, was studying the demand for potato flour. That was a big deal in Holland at the time. They were growing a lot of potatoes, and it was important to understand what the demand for that was. And so Tinbergen had data on both quantities and prices of potato flour, but it's clear that prices were not set randomly. They're set very far from randomly. And so you couldn't simply compare the periods in which the prices were high and look at the quantities in those periods and compare them with quantities during periods when the prices were low and interpret that as the causal effect of prices on demand for potato flour. So what did Tinbergen do instead? What he did, and kind of what the economists have been doing ever since, he built a model for the economic process. He built a model for how the buyers were behaving, corresponding to a demand function. He built a model for how the sellers were behaving, a supply function, and he built a model for how the two groups interacted, namely through a market that determines the prices. Now, I'm going to come back to this and illustrate this with some data, but let me just say here that this was really a remarkable kind of insight in how you could figure out some causal effects in settings that were very far from random assignment. And as I said before, Tinbergen won the Nobel Prize for this in 1969. Growing up, he was one of my heroes, partly because in addition to being a great scholar, he was a great human being. He was very active in social movements in the Netherlands. And for example, took in multiple children from Hungary after the 1956 uprising. So what happened after that? So economists became more and more enchanted by these models and then built more and more complex models. Here's the picture here is actually from a physical version of such a model. This particular model called Moniac was built by engineer economist Phillips, for the economists known from the Phillips curve. And so what he did was build a physical model of the economy where water flows corresponded to the flows of money through the economy. And so in principle here, you could simulate policies. You could see what the implication would be of some new government investment that would bring in more water in a particular part of the model. You could simulate fixed exchange rates versus flexible exchange rates. You could increase the interest rate, and you could see what that did for the economy. Now, it was a great model. So so he built 3 of these, and one of them was in Rotterdam when I was a student there. And they would wheel it out once a year and kind of demonstrate it. And it was a great thing because it really didn't work very well. Whatever they did, the thing would drain very quickly because it was fairly old by that time and it was leaking in lots of places. And so whatever policy you followed, very quickly the economy would crash and there would be nothing left in the economy. And so at some point they stopped demonstrating it and they put it in this big box, so they just keep it there without using it. But the failure of that model was somewhat symbolic of the failure of some of these mathematical models that economists were using at the time. And so in 1983, there was a very influential paper by Ed Leamer where he complained about it. It had a very clever title, "Let's Take the Con Out of Econometrics." And he argued, it's a very nice paper. Leamer is a very eloquent, a very good writer. And sort of he wrote somewhere in the paper that nobody really believes empirical work in economics. Or more precisely, nobody believes anybody else's empirical work. And he tried to demonstrate that by looking at a set of studies that looked at the deterrence effect of the death penalty. And kind of, if you look at these studies, it's quite remarkable because some of these studies made extravagant claims where they said that, for every person that the government executes, we would save 20 lives by saving 20 murders. Other studies said, well, no, for every execution, it actually costs 12 lives. There would be 12 more murders. And both sides would argue this kind of with claiming great precision for their estimates. And it was very clear that what Leamer said, that nobody really believes those estimates was right. And nobody should believe those estimates. They were really based on very complex models that didn't really have much credibility. And this was really the starting point from our perspective, kind of that started what later became, what Angus later called the credibility revolution, where a bunch of economists, many of them starting at Princeton, Ashenfelter, Card, Lalonde, Angus, Kruger, started trying to find better ways of doing empirical work that was more credible, where we could actually make the case that this was believable work. And so, in some sense, what that credibility revolution did was bring together some of the insights from the statistics literature and understanding where the credibility of the randomized experiments came from with some of the insights from the economics and social science literature, where we did think about how people behave and made some assumptions on that, but not as much as in some of the work that had been done in between the Tinbergen and Lemur work. And so what the key features of that literature is that we're looking for credible variation in causal variables and transparent assumptions. And what you can see very quickly is that if you're trying to look at the deterrence effect of the death penalty, that's going to be pretty much impossible, because the variation there in regulations is so complicated and so coarse that it's very hard to imagine that that really motivates, that really enters into the behavior of individuals who are thinking about committing the relevant the crimes. And that in cases like that, there really isn't much hope for getting credible estimates based on the current the data. And so we're looking in general for credible variation in causal variables. We're looking for robustness to these models so that tweaking the models a little bit doesn't change them very much. And we're looking for support for the critical assumptions through additional analysis. And so now the rest of the talk, I'm going to go through 4 examples where that works out relatively well. And again, that's not to say that these examples are perfect. And in some sense, they're always going to be second best, because in cases where you can do experiments, they would be more convincing. But we're going to be making much more credible, much less controversial assumptions and much clearer assumptions in these cases. And often we can do analysis that show that these estimates really are credible. So the first example is from Angus' thesis, where he tried to estimate the effect of the serving in the military on earnings. And so the problem is that if you just compare veterans and non-veterans, they may be different in lots of different ways. So for example, during World War II, the veterans were higher educated than non-veterans. So if you just compare their earnings, that may be due not to the fact that they served in the military and what they learned there, but just to the fact that they had higher levels of education. So we can't simply compare veterans and non-veterans. And we may be worried that even if we adjust for some of the differences in characteristics, there's going to be other things. They may have different attitudes towards risk. They may have different interests or preferences that make these comparisons not so credible. So what Angus did was exploit the fact that during the Vietnam War, there was a lottery that determined priority for the draft. So I'm going to kind of simplify things. I'm going to think of this as that just being a lottery that makes you either draft eligible, I'm going to call that drafted, or not draft eligible, I'm going to call that not drafted. So now we have these 2 groups that are directly comparable, because at the lottery, these groups have the same characteristics, at least in distribution. Now, it wasn't actually quite like that. They did this lottery on TV, and they didn't do it completely right. And so later people have looked at the sequence of lottery numbers, and it turned out they messed it up because they didn't shake the box enough with the balls in there. They put them all in there, but you need to shake them up to make it random, and they didn't do that. But for all intents and purposes, it's going to be as good as random, and you don't actually see any differences in characteristics. But the problem is that the people who were drafted were not all serving in the military. Some of them did, but some of them had medical exemptions. They may have had serious conditions, or they may have had bone spurs, or they may have had reasons why they didn't serve in the military. And at the same time, there were people who were not drafted who did serve in the military, who volunteered. And so we still can't compare the people who actually served with the people who didn't, because they're composed of different sets of people. So now here's how you can think about it. You can think about there being 3 sets of people, and Angus and I labeled them from a different application, always takers, never takers, and compliers. Always takers are really the volunteers in this setting. They would serve in the military irrespective of whether they would get drafted or not. The never takers would not serve in the military irrespective of whether they got drafted or not. So for neither of those groups did the draft lottery actually do anything in terms of veteran status. They were always going to go in the same path. But then there's this third group, the compliers, and they would only serve if they got drafted, but not serve if they didn't get drafted. So for them, the draft made a big difference. These were the people who were sitting there watching the TV and being very anxious, because if they got a low lottery number, they would actually get drafted, and they would serve. If they got a high lottery number, they wouldn't get drafted, they wouldn't have to serve. For them, it made a big difference. Now, so here it's slightly more technical. What can we learn about these groups? Well, we can, if we partition the population both by draft status and veteran status, we have these four groups: the not drafted non-veterans, the drafted non-veterans, the not drafted veterans, and the drafted veterans. And we can use the fact that we get the proportions in these four groups to disentangle the population shares of these three types: the never takers, the compliers, and the always takers. And so it turns out about 19% of the men in these birth cohorts volunteered. About 69% would never serve in the military. But there were these 12% in the middle who would serve if they got drafted and not serve if they didn't get drafted. In some sense, for these 12%, we have a randomized experiment, because the lottery was random. If we could just tell who these people were, we could just compare them with and without the military service. But we can't tell who they are, because they're mixed up with these other groups. And so what we do then is make one more assumption, namely that for the never takers and the always takers, the draft didn't matter. It didn't matter for whether they served, but we're assuming it also doesn't matter for their earnings. That's a much bigger assumption. And that's, you can argue about that, and there's reasons why it may not hold. And this is sort of where having a completely randomized experiment would be better, because you wouldn't rely on that assumption. But let's just go with that assumption for the time being. And what that allows us to do is figure out what the earnings are for these compliers in these two states of the world, serving and not serving. And we see, what we can find is that the average effect for the compliers, what we call the local average treatment effect, is about 20% lower earnings per year later for these people who served in the military. So in some sense, there was a 20% tax for these people later. Now, this is of course great. This is a very nice example, but the lottery there is very special. So part of the concern early on in this literature was, are these situations really special? Is it, can you do this in different settings? How easy is it going to be to do this in other settings? So here's another example. I'm going to keep that somewhat brief. But here, this is a paper I did with another Brown economics Ph.D., Robert van der Klauw. We looked at military service in the Netherlands. So they did have compulsory military service when I grew up there. But at some point, they had too many people, and the military didn't know what to do with them. They just didn't quite need that many people to do whatever they were doing in those days. They weren't fighting any wars. They were just practicing, but they had too many people. And so they had to find some way of getting rid of some of the people whom they would normally call up. And they decided, for whatever reason, to just do it by exempting one entire year for military service. And so there was one lucky year, birth year 1959, that was exempt from military service. And so if you look at how many people served in other years, so in 58 and 60, it's about 40%. If you look at what earnings were later for these people, and this is earnings in 1990, you see that the average for these two, the year before and the year after, is 48.3 thousand euro. That's what you would have expected had that year been subject to the same compulsory schooling regulations as in the year before and the year after. But if you actually look at average earnings in the Netherlands for men from that birth year, it's a little higher. And so kind of then translating that to the effect of military service, it's about 4%. These people paid about a 4% price for serving in the military. And to make that even more credible, what you can do is do the same analysis for women in the Netherlands. There was no compulsory military service for women, so there should be no effect. And if you do that comparison, you see that the women in that year don't look any better than the year before or the year after. So there was no evidence of any effect there, making it more credible that this bump for the earnings for this birth cohort was really due to the fact that they were exempt from military service. Let me look at the third example, and this goes back to the Tinbergen type problem. Here, so let me get. Here I'm going to illustrate this using data that I analyzed together with Katie Grady and Josh Angris. These were data that Katie had collected for a Ph.D. thesis at Princeton. And collecting the data actually was a very, very impressive piece of work here. She would go from Princeton to the Fulton Fish Market in New York for a couple of months every morning, getting there at 2 a.m. to collect the data in this very unpleasant, very smelly and unfriendly place. There was a lot of concern about involvement by organized crime in the market there. This was not a great place to be collecting data. But she collected these data on prices and quantities of whiting there. And so you may be interested, for example, in what would happen if there was a tax imposed on that market. And so we're going to want to estimate the demand function and possibly also the supply function. But what you see first are just prices and quantities for the fish there on these different days. So how are we going to make sense of that? Well, following Tinbergen, first thing we do is kind of put some structure on that. We think that these prices and quantities are really the intersection of supply and demand functions on these different days. On any particular day, the supply function may be different, the demand function may be different, and you end up with different prices and quantities. That doesn't help an enormous amount because you still need to figure out how you get to the supply and demand functions just from these intersections. And so there, what Katie did was come up with something that plays the same role of the lottery number in the Angris draft lottery example, what the economists would call an instrument. In this case, something that affects the supply of whiting, but not the demand for whiting. And what she came up with was weather at sea on the day before the market as a way of shifting supply. So whether it's stormy at sea the day before doesn't change whether I want to eat fish today. And so it doesn't change the demand for fish the next day. But it does make it much harder to catch the fish. If it's very stormy, if the waves are high, it's just going to be hard to catch the fish. And so it changes the supply, and the supply will be relatively low. Prices are going to be relatively high, and quantities are going to be relatively low. And then if you compare that to fair days, to days where the weather is great for catching fish, you'll see that on average the price is going to be lower, the quantities are going to be higher, and we're in a different equilibrium on average. But it doesn't change the average demand function, because that's not really affected by what the weather is like at sea. So if you look at these two figures combined, then you see that if the average demand function doesn't change, but the weather changes the supply there by making it more difficult to catch the fish, you can trace out now the demand function. And doing that gives you an estimate of the price elasticity, gives you an estimate of the slope of the demand function that is much more credible, much more natural than simply looking at the correlation between prices and quantities. Now, let me give one final example. And this is from a study I did with Don Rubin and Bruce Sasserdote, who was a student in this first casual inference class. So we were interested in the effect of a universal basic income. We're interested in what people would do if they have a guaranteed stream of income. And so I want to measure that kind of by thinking about, for every dollar that you guarantee for people, how much less are they going to work? How much less are they actually going to earn? So you could imagine that if that is 100 cents per dollar, it means that the total income isn't actually going up. You give them $1 and now they stop working to the same degree that their total income doesn't go up. If it's 0, it means it doesn't affect how much they work. And it's an empirical question how much it actually is in practice, but it's of great importance for thinking about the Social Security system, how much we should worry about people working less if we give them a guaranteed income. And so what we did is go to the lottery. We went to the Massachusetts lottery where every week they give out large sums of money to people who get very lucky. And so what we did is we surveyed about 340 people who'd won large sums of money in the lottery. The nice thing there about that lottery, and I think many of these lotteries, is they don't actually give you one check for the total amount. They pay it out over 20 years. So it actually gets much closer to looking like a basic income. So that if you win 400,000, that may seem like a lot if you get it in one go, but in fact, per year, now that's just $20,000 per year. And clearly, doing an experiment like that would have been incredibly expensive. Not to say that the control group would have been very unhappy with being in that experiment. But the lottery does it for us. And so we surveyed these people. We got about half of them to respond. Now, it turns out that even though you would think that the lottery is completely random, there were still substantial differences between the winners and the losers. Why is that? Well, there's two reasons, really. One is that the randomization obviously is not over individuals, it's over lottery tickets. And different people may buy different numbers of lottery tickets. Second thing, and probably the most important thing, is that the response rate varies, and rich people are much less likely to respond there. We were asking these people lots of very invasive questions. We're asking them to release their Social Security earnings to us. So there's a lot of reasons why people may not have been willing to respond. But once you do some statistical analysis, once you do some adjustment for the background variables we observed, we actually get very credible estimates where the range of estimates is from about 5 cents per dollar in the unearned income to about 10 cents per dollar in unearned income. So people reduce their labor supply so that their earnings go down about 5 to 10 cents per dollar they get given. Why do we believe that, as Lima would ask? Yes. Why do we believe that? Well, we could do the same analysis, but pretending people won 1 year prior to when they actually won. And we can then use the earnings, which we also know the year prior to that when they won, as the outcome. Because then we know that the causal effect is 0. Nobody knows in advance that they're going to be winning the lottery. So we know the true causal effect must be exactly 0. And when we do that analysis, instead of getting these estimates that we got on the actual outcome, we get estimates that are very close to zero. And that's partly what makes these analyses just very credible here. We're very sure that these estimates are on the right order of magnitude. So let me wrap up here. That causality, in some sense, is central kind of to all policy advice, to all policy making. When we can do experiments, that can be incredibly helpful, but in many cases that's not possible. And so what the work I've been involved in, and what much of the empirical work in economics has done in the last 20, 30 years, is trying to find very credible ways of getting to causal facts through thinking about the assignment mechanism, through thinking about additional analysis, and thinking about cases where there's credible variation in the causal variables. So thank you very much. And,
So we're going to have time for, maybe about 10, 15 minutes for question and answers. Thank you for that terrific lecture. I'm sure a lot of people learned a ton. Maybe just to start off very generally, if you could just tell us what you think are some of the maybe most memorable impacts you feel econometrics has had on the real world. You started off by saying how you were motivated by its impact on real world problems. So what are some of the biggest issues?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. So kind of thinking about the more recent work, clearly the work David Card has done, that he got awarded the Nobel Prize for, has been incredibly influential. His work on the effects of immigration, his work on the minimum wage. It's just remarkable to see how quickly that affected policy debates and was taken into account. Going back, kind of, you should have mentioned how I got interested in some of these things. Timburger's work in Holland was incredibly influential in policy circles, to the point that one of the institutions he set up, called the Central Planning Bureau, would actually, before every election, take the political manifestos of all the political parties and would actually predict what the economy would do, how the economy would fare under their proposals. And these things actually played a big role, and they disciplined the political parties into making more reasonable proposals and being forced to take into account what the consequences were.
No, that's great. If you have questions, please, there are microphones on the two aisles, and so please feel free to line up and ask questions. I'll ask one more, and then please, great to hear from the audience. Maybe as people are thinking about answering the questions, Guido, if you can tell us, what are you most excited about in terms of the frontiers of this kind of work around causal inference?
So there's lots of things I'm still very excited about doing more work on. So I think there's kind of been a little bit of a false dichotomy between kind of experimental studies and observational studies, and I think there's a lot of interesting ideas about trying to find ways of combining them, sort of trying to do kind of targeted experiments to learn about very specific things, but combining them with substantive economic or other social science models to make sure that we can answer lots of questions, because often experiments, they're always going to be expensive. It's always going to be limited where you can do them. And so what you need to try to do is kind of find ways of leveraging them to generate general knowledge rather than just answering narrow questions. So that's one thing. And second kind of thing closely related to that is that actually designing experiments in more complex settings is a topic I find fascinating at the moment. So I described these agriculture experiments, kind of, or giving the kids honey, and there you don't have to worry about the the children or the plots of land interacting. But in many of the settings we're interested in social sciences, the people interact in complicated ways. And so changing something in their environment is going to affect everybody else as well. And so even thinking about what good experiments are that can help us figure out how to advise policymakers what kind of things to do is a much bigger challenge than it is traditionally in the agricultural or biomedical settings.
That's great. Yeah, you have a question, and if you could just introduce yourself at first.
Sure. Hello. Hi, my name is Michael. I am a senior studying economics and international relations, also an incoming Schwarzman scholar. And my question for you is, the title of this talk is Causality in Data Science. And when I think about the impact of data, I think about how predictive analytics is perhaps the next step of how we cope with the increasing of data we have in the real world and perhaps provide more predictive analysis. However, in your talk, you have also spoken a lot about the design of experiments that is vital to creating a causal effect. I wonder to what extent it is possible for us to utilize artificial intelligence in your experiment, your knowledge, to make the process of generating knowledge on causality more efficient in the future. Thank you.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So the whole sort of all the machine learning literature has made enormous strides in giving us better predictive methods. If I look at the type of predictive methods we were using in econometrics early on in my career, and I see what is now available, it's just completely different. And so these methods are going to help us enormously, but they are often not directly geared towards estimating causal effects. So one of the current challenges is to find ways of adapting them, of harnessing the power in those methods to look at causal effects. But those things are changing the way econometrics is being done, econometrics is being taught enormously, and we haven't really fully appreciated and exploited the benefits from combining them with these causal settings.
Thank you.
Great. Yes, over here.
Hi, Professor. Hope you're well. My name is Samir. I'm a research assistant here at Brown. My question is sort of linked to this idea of like interdisciplinarity and how that affects experiments, but less so from the computational quantitative side, like that you've seen in economics, from computer science to more rigorous mathematics, and more so from sort of like the mixed methods, sociology, ethnographic approaches. And so I guess like could you speak a little bit to like the importance of, I guess, cultural understanding and more broadly, like the way that we think about experimental design across different settings and how that might influence causal effects in different communities around the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. So initially, when people like Banerjee, Duflo, and Kramer were doing experiments, there was concern, there was pushback that the external validity of a lot of those experiments wasn't very high. You could do an experiment in one particular place, and you wouldn't necessarily learn about what was relevant and what would work in other places. And so I think that challenge sort of has been embraced subsequently in that literature, and people are trying to find ways of doing richer, doing more complex experiments that do justice to the fact that there's a lot of heterogeneity in responses, not just by individual characteristics, but by types of communities and different cultures. And that goes back kind of to the comment I made about finding ways of combining observational studies and experiments. The answer is not kind of doing experiments in every single setting, but trying to understand where the heterogeneity is coming from, trying to use the experiments to validate the models in a way that we're going to be more confident to extrapolate them to other settings, and understanding where the heterogeneity is most important.
Great. Let me just follow up on that question and return to your earlier studies around homelessness, which is something that you started your career working on, and now with all the advances and different methodologies, but also with the rise of homelessness that we're seeing in our society, how might you design a study or learn from certain studies on how we might be able to reduce this crisis of homelessness in the country?
Yes, I mean that's a hugely important problem, and so in California, it's a very visible problem these days, and it's been very surprising to me, given how much attention and when the current governor of California was mayor of San Francisco, I was living in Palo Alto at the time, but commuting to Berkeley, and so I would hear him on public radio often, and he was very engaged with homelessness problems at that time, and he was actually visiting homeless shelters every week for a while. And so there was clearly an enormous amount of government attention locally for homelessness, and it hasn't helped. So I don't really have any answers there, but I do think that is an area where it seems inconceivable that we couldn't do a much better job than we're doing at the moment. And yes, so I think we need to do more work, and that's probably something I should go back to as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think we have time for one last question. Yes?
Hi, Professor. A question that I had was, you mentioned
you can just
the challenge
introduce yourself, please.
Oh, sorry. The challenge of, I guess, advising policymakers with like the data and studies you've done. But I think in general, with the public, there seems to be like some sort of like a disconnect between like the economic studies that have been done and like public opinion, but also a disconnect between like the politicians and also the economic studies to back those like their policy making. So I think my question is like, how do you go about, I guess, like communicating these studies and like the result of the studies better to the public in terms of like, just explaining what the studies actually do and what it entails?
Yeah, so that's a very tricky thing, and so most of what I have done is sort of one step away from directly advising the governments and policymakers. A lot of my co-authors have been much more involved in policy advice. One of the people was very active in this natural experiments literature. In fact, he was a co-author of David Carr, Josh Angris, as well as me. Alan Kruger was very involved in policy making for many years. And so, in fact, what I've found really remarkable since coming from the Netherlands here is to see how often there's close connections and close communications between policymakers and academics. So I think we both have our separate roles to play, but we should try to make clear to policymakers what the implications of the work is, even if people are not directly advising governments.
Great. We've come to the end of our time. Thank you so much, Guido, for a terrific talk and a wonderful session. Please join me in thanking Professor Imbens.